I'm Leonard McCue, and I'm here at the Dalí this morning to talk about Dalí, his paintings, but more importantly, about Eleanor and Reynolds Morse. Just to know who I am, I want you to know that I was a college professor and taught psychology, which will explain the way I view these paintings. I do not view them as an art critic or from the technical standpoint of an artist, but more from my own observations based on my background as a psychologist. When the museum first opened, I had visited the museum a number of times. During that time, I met Reynolds Morse and his wife, Eleanor, the founders of the museum. They had put together the largest collection of Dalí paintings at that time held by any individual. As we spent time together, the Morses and myself and my wife, we learned that we had a lot of things in common. And in fact, out of those commonalities, we became very, very good friends. Actually, very good friends from the time that we met through the passing of both of them. During their tenure, I became a board member here at the museum and served on the board for 12 or 13 years. There were some difficult times and there were some easy times. Difficult meaning financially raising funds, but also in a difference in attitude towards the paintings, which interestingly enough, Ren and I shared. There was a big call to share our paintings with other museums. Ren was violently opposed to that, and so was I. At that time, the type of transfer of paintings and the way they were shipped and the way paintings were handled does not even begin to mimic what's done today. They weren't terribly protected. Ren told me one of his favorite paintings was actually damaged in a show that he had agreed to lend a couple of paintings. That experience certainly affected his thinking about whether or not we should be shipping paintings willy-nilly throughout the country. And I agreed with him. In fact, one of my main concerns was the building we were in, which isn't this beautiful, incredible building, but a very poorly constructed building that, should we have had a major storm, we probably would have lost the entire collection. So at that time, my concern was really protecting these incredible paintings. And when others on the board argued with Ren, I vehemently supported him. And quite honestly, at the time, we were successful in keeping those paintings protected in our building. Ultimately, as the process of lending our collection, or parts of our collection, but getting other collections lent to us, which, interestingly enough, wasn't occurring early on when we were being asked to lend our paintings. When we were asking, well, what will you be lending us? Oh, they said, well, nothing. We want yours. We're going to have a few Dalís. We're having a surrealism show, and we'd like to have a number of your paintings, but nothing in return. That didn't make any sense to me. It certainly didn't make any sense to Ren. So we fought vehemently to keep them from going, and we were successful. And as a result of that, we have all these beautiful paintings. Yes, we do lend them, but now with curators traveling with them, with packing cases that aren't simply cardboard, now we feel much more comfortable lending these paintings, but getting paintings from very excellent collections for people to view in our own museum. Some of you have recognized quite quickly that I have a Boston accent. I am, in fact, from Boston, and oddly enough, so is that painting, because that painting resided in a bank in Boston. Luckily for me, my family banked in that bank, and for some reason I can't remember, I was going down the stairs in the back of the bank one day and saw the painting in a stairwell and was absolutely fascinated by this painting. It was a beautiful painting. I certainly enjoyed looking at it, didn't understand why it was hidden away in a back hallway, but that was the end of my experience seeing it in that bank in Boston. Until I was in Zurich, Switzerland with Mr. Morse, and we had heard that there was going to be a display in a museum in Zurich, including a number of Dalís. No mention of the homage to Watson and Crick. But when we were viewing the exhibit, lo and behold, here is the painting that I recognized immediately from the hallway of the bank in Boston. A painting that I really liked very much. It tells a fascinating story of Watson and Crick and is symbolic and important in this day and age when you view the museum. And I'm going to tell you about that in a moment. But I have to tell you what Ren's reaction was to this painting. He didn't like it. I didn't understand that and tried to do a sales job right at that time, saying, this is another one of the masterworks that should be hanging in our museum. No, he didn't want to have anything to do with it. Look at it, he said. It's almost only one color. It's almost monochromatic. In fact, if you look at it, it only has, I believe, about 3 different colors in the painting. And when you first look at the painting, it doesn't jump out at you like the Toreador does or many of the other masterworks. It's much more subtle. Finally, Ren, though he never fully came around to this painting, did decide that it should at least be displayed here because it's a masterwork. It was okay to him eventually, and I have to admit, I did a lot of coercing to try to get him to consider the painting as a masterwork and to bring it here to exhibit this painting as one of our masterworks. But once it was here, and with the influence of Eleanor, who really began to enjoy the painting, the museum ultimately purchased the painting. And we are really blessed to have it here and not hiding out in the back staircase of a local bank in Boston. I personally believe that Dalí's paintings are the most revealing paintings by any contemporary artist there is. In fact, I know of no other artist who reveals so much of himself through his paintings. It's as if he stripped his soul bare and threw it out onto the canvas. They tell so much about him. If you reach into all the paintings that you see here at the museum, you will find that what you're reaching into is the soul of Salvador Dalí. And that's an incredible journey. You may have noticed that I have a crest on my jacket. It has an interesting motto. The motto is, "Who dares wins." You can't imagine what people said to Reynolds and Eleanor when they began to collect Dalís. People thought they were crazy to spend good money on these crazy paintings which nobody understood. Reynolds understood. He recognized the genius of Dalí. He stepped out. He dared to collect a type of painting by an at that time, an unknown artist, when everyone else was collecting very typical paintings and European paintings. Whatever was correct, they collected, not Reynolds. Reynolds stepped out of the box, as we say, and began to collect Dalí paintings. It didn't make any sense except to Reynolds. Obviously, traveling to Spain with Reynolds was an experience. Going to Figueres, going to many of the other little towns that was familiar in Dalí's paintings certainly was an experience that one couldn't get anywhere. It was like traveling with Salvador himself. I met what was at the time the official photographer of Dalí, Mele, who was an interesting fellow in his own right, who had, by the way, a vast collection of photographs. And we got along real well, for whatever reason. He recognized my admiration for all things Dalí. And he said to me, I want to show you something that I did. And he said, and I'm going to make a gift of it to you. And he went into the corner and he pulled out a big roll. And on one of the tables, he began to unroll what appeared to be a photograph. But it couldn't be a photograph because it was approximately 8 feet long and 3 or 4 feet wide. And what it was and what it is, as it hangs in the foyer of my office building, is a photograph of the crucifixion by St. John when the painting was in fact pristine and undamaged. So I have this beautiful photograph. It's a vision of the crucifixion looking down on the cross. It's an absolutely beautiful perspective to view the crucifixion. We were in the museum in Figueres, and at that time, Dalí was living up on the second floor. He had an apartment on the second floor. And he had recently been burned. He fell asleep apparently with a cigarette in bed, and the bed caught fire. So he got badly burned around his face and neck. And Reynolds had asked me if I wanted to meet Dalí. Well, as you can imagine, that was incredibly important to me to meet Salvador Dalí. So Reynolds and I went up to the second floor because we had an appointment to meet Dalí. And Reynolds knocked on the door, and we heard a voice behind the door. Quite honestly, I think it was Deschamps. I'm not sure, but I think it was Deschamps, who told Ren through the door, he's not coming out. So Reynolds was angry and insistent. And then we heard Dalí. And Dalí told Reynolds, and by the way, he spoke Spanish, and said that he did not want him to see him because he was embarrassed by the way he looked. And he didn't want Reynolds to see him in that position. Quite honestly, Reynolds was still, he was still upset about Dalí not taking the time to see him regardless of how he looked. Because think of the investment, never mind financially, but think of the investment in time and you know, all such a large portion of his life invested in this individual called Salvador Dalí, and yet he didn't want him to see him that way. He wouldn't open the door. And of course, I was terribly disappointed in not seeing Dalí. One of the most interesting trips that the Morses and my wife and I made together was as part of an organization that both of us belong to. It's the Order of St. Lazarus. As a result of that, both Reynolds and I were knighted by the organization. I sort of enjoy the thought that my indoctrination came in Spain by the Spanish king and ultimately knighted by the Spanish king, Juan Carlos. It's been very important to us to support what we really believe in, and that is the art of Dalí and what we know what its contribution will be to the future generations. My mother also, early on, before her passing, helped to support this museum. And I think that's really symbolic of why my wife and I do also. Because my mother always taught that you owe future generations whatever you can possibly contribute to them. We as individuals have got to assume the responsibility and the obligation to do whatever we can to be sure that these institutions prosper and continue to thrive in order to benefit future generations. What would St. Petersburg or the world be without the paintings of Salvador Dalí? Let's be sure that we always keep in mind it's our responsibility and it's our obligation. The Dalí Museum is the repository of Salvador Dalí's soul. If you would like to take a journey into the very soul of Salvador Dalí, and in a similar way into the heart and soul of the Morses, Reynolds, and Eleanor, then you must join us here at the Salvador Dalí Museum.